Get out of that seat right now. You people always try this." The words hit the cabin like a dropped glass. Marcus Whitfield did not flinch. He sat in seat 2A, with his hands folded loosely on his lap, his gray wool coat still buttoned, his breathing even and slow. He did not look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes were calm in a way that made the woman standing over him even angrier. Because calm was not the reaction she had been expecting. Brenda Sutcliffe stood in the aisle with her arms crossed, her blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight. It looked painful. Her Continental Crest Airlines scarf knotted just so at her throat. She looked like a woman who had never once been told no, and had built her entire identity around making sure it stayed that way. Behind her, Gerald Ashworth adjusted his watch, a heavy gold thing that caught the cabin light every time he moved his wrist, which was often as if he wanted to be sure everyone noticed it. His wife, Diane, stood beside him in a cream coat, with her hands folded over an alligator skin handbag, her lips pressed into a thin smile that never once reached her eyes. "Sir, I need you to gather your belongings and move to economy," Brenda said. Her voice had the practiced brightness of someone reciting a script she'd used 100 times before on 100 other passengers who looked like Marcus. "That won't be necessary," Marcus said. "This is my assigned seat." He lifted his boarding pass between fingers. She barely glanced at it. Across the aisle, a man in his 60s lowered his newspaper an inch. 2 rows back, a college student paused with her phone halfway to her ear. Somewhere near the galley, a service cart wheel clicked against the floor and then went still. The cabin held its breath the way cabins do right before something breaks. "There must be some confusion with the system," Diane said, her voice syrupy and cool at once. "These things happen. People get seated where they don't belong all the time." Marcus heard what she didn't say. He had heard it before, in hotel lobbies in Scottsdale, in boardrooms in Manhattan, at a black tie gala in Aspen, where a donor had once asked him, quite sincerely, if he could bring around the car. The words changed. The meaning never did. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth are Platinum Legacy members," Brenda said, straightening. "They fly this route to Seattle every single month. This seat is part of their regular accommodation." "Regular is not the same as assigned," Marcus said. His voice did not rise. It stayed low, level, a blade wrapped in velvet. Gerald's face reddened. "Do you have any idea how much money we spend with this airline every year?" Marcus turned to face him directly for the first time. "No," he said, "and you have no idea who I am." The sentence landed and did not bounce. It just sat there, heavy in the recycled cabin air. Brenda felt it. Gerald felt it. Diane felt it most of all. Her fingers tightened around the handbag strap until the leather groaned. 2 rows back, the college student lifted her phone and began quietly recording. Denver International Airport had been restless since 6 that morning. Gate C-14 buzzed with the particular anxiety of a Tuesday departure. Rolling suitcases clattering over tile. A toddler wailing somewhere near the coffee kiosk. Business people checking their watches as though staring hard enough might bend time. Above the gate, the departure board blinked an update nobody wanted to see. Continental Crest Flight 942 to Seattle. Delayed 25 minutes. Marcus Whitfield stood near the priority boarding line with a slim black leather satchel over one shoulder. He wore a charcoal overcoat, plain dark slacks, and scuffed brown Oxfords that had clearly seen a decade of travel. Nothing about him announced money. Nothing about him announced anything at all, which was exactly the way he preferred it. On his left wrist sat an old steel watch with a cracked leather band. The kind of watch a man keeps not because it's valuable, but because it's irreplaceable. His grandfather, Otis Whitfield, had given it to him the morning Marcus graduated from Morehouse College, 22 years and 4 companies ago. Otis had worked 31 years loading freight at a rail yard outside Birmingham, Alabama, and had never once, in all those years, been called by his first name by a single supervisor. He'd been Whitfield, or Boy, or Hey You. He died 3 months before Marcus sold his first company for $11 million, and Marcus had never stopped wishing his grandfather could have lived to see the second one. Never let a room decide your worth before you've had the chance to open your mouth, Otis used to say. Marcus had carried that sentence into 100 rooms that did not want him there. He checked his phone. A message waited from Priya Anand, his chief of staff. Board call moved to 4 p.m. your time. Continental Crest CEO wants a final word with you before the partnership vote tomorrow. He typed back a single word, understood, and slid the phone into his coat pocket. At 46, Marcus had built Meridian Trust Systems into one of the most respected companies in the country, working on algorithmic fairness, software that combed through hiring platforms, lending models, and customer service systems, hunting for the quiet, buried bias that most companies pretended didn't exist. The irony of where he was flying to would have been almost funny if it weren't so bitter. Continental Crest Airlines, a company drowning in 3 years of viral videos, lawsuits, and a scathing congressional hearing about how unevenly it treated its passengers, had spent 8 months courting Meridian for a contract that could save what was left of its public reputation. Tomorrow morning, in Seattle, Marcus was scheduled to give the closing recommendation to his own board on whether Meridian should sign. Tonight, he told himself, was supposed to be simple. 4 hours in the air, a little rest, a little work on his notes for the keynote he'd give in 2 days at the National Ethics in Technology Summit, titled, with the irony he hadn't fully appreciated until just now, "Who Gets Believed First?" The gate agent lifted her microphone. Now boarding Platinum Legacy members and first class for Continental Crest, Flight 942 to Seattle. A ripple moved through the crowd. Shoulders straightened. Rolling bags jerked forward like dogs on a leash. Gerald and Diane Ashworth stepped into the priority lane as though it had been built specifically for them. Gerald was 61, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, wearing a navy suit that announced money before he'd said a single word. Diane, 58, wore a cream wool coat, pearl studs, and the frozen, half-smile of a woman accustomed to being recognized before she had to ask twice. Finally, Diane murmured, loudly enough for the gate agent to hear. Gerald's eyes drifted to Marcus, standing 3 people ahead of them in line. His gaze moved over Marcus's coat, his shoes, the plain black satchel, a quick, practiced sweep, a judgment disguised as nothing at all. Marcus felt it land, the way you feel a draft from an open door you can't see. He said nothing. He never did in these moments. Saying something never changed the sweep. It only ever changed how the room saw him afterward. He stepped forward, scanned his phone, and the gate reader chimed green. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield," the gate agent said. "Seat 2A. Enjoy your flight." Behind him, Diane's head snapped toward Gerald. "Did she say 2A? That's our row." The first-class cabin of the Airbus gleamed under crisp white lighting, cream leather seats, brushed steel trim, oval windows catching the gray Denver morning. Marcus stowed his satchel overhead and settled into 2A by the window, exhaling for what felt like the first time all day. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the click of his seatbelt, the faint smell of leather polish, and the soft blue glow of his tablet opening to his note. He wanted 3 hours. 3 hours where nobody needed him to prove anything he had already earned twice over. Then a shadow fell across his row. Gerald Ashworth stood in the aisle, Diane just behind him, her smile already gone. Gerald looked down at Marcus the way a man looks at a stain he's found on an otherwise clean carpet. Excuse me," Gerald said. "You're in our seat." Marcus looked up. The cabin noise seemed to thin out around them, not because anyone had gone quiet, but because something old and familiar had just walked back into the room. "Our seat," Marcus repeated. He didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a man setting a small stone down on the table between them, waiting to see who would pretend not to notice it was there. "I've been flying this route for 11 years, Gerald said, his jaw tightening. My wife and I always sit here. 2A and 2B. Always. Marcus glanced at his own boarding pass, then back up. Your seat is 2C, he said, and held the pass out. Gerald did not take it. That refusal told Marcus everything he needed to know. The truth was never the problem. The problem was that accepting the truth would have required Gerald to accept the word no, and Marcus had learned a long time ago that some men would rather set the whole room on fire than say those two letters out loud. That has to be a mistake, Diane said, her voice climbing half an octave. Gerald prefers the window. I understand, Marcus said evenly, but my boarding pass says 2A. A businessman 3 rows back lowered his phone an inch to watch. A woman across the aisle pretended to search her purse while glancing sideways through her lashes. Diane leaned toward her husband. Get someone, she hissed, and as if summoned by rank rather than sound, Brenda Sutcliffe appeared from the forward galley. Mr. Ashworth, is everything all right? Brenda's smile was warm, practiced, instant, for him. It cooled the second she turned to Marcus. There's been a seating error, Gerald said. This gentleman is in our row. Brenda's eyes moved over Marcus too quickly. Coat, shoes, watch, face, skin, and something in her expression didn't accuse him outright. It did something worse, it decided. Sir, may I see your boarding pass? She asked. Marcus handed it over. She examined it far longer than the 4 seconds it should have taken. Tapped her tablet, frowned, tapped again. The silence stretched thin enough to hear the overhead vents hiss. It does show 2A, she admitted finally. Then fix it, Gerald snapped. Brenda's cheeks colored, but she leaned toward Marcus and lowered her voice into that particular register meant to sound professional to him and reasonable to everyone listening. Sir, Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth are Platinum Legacy members. They have a long-standing seating arrangement with us. I'm sure you can understand accommodating our most loyal customers. Something cold settled behind Marcus's ribs. Not surprise, recognition. I'm also a paying customer, he said. Of course, Brenda said, the words coming out flat and automatic. Nobody's questioning that. She was. Everyone in the cabin could feel that she was. There are plenty of other seats, Diane said, crossing her arms. Surely this doesn't need to become difficult. It became difficult, Marcus said, turning to her. When you ask me to give up the one I already paid for. Gerald let out a short, ugly laugh. Come on. It's one seat, then sit in yours, Marcus said. Something in the cabin tightened, the way a rope tightens right before it snaps. A man across the aisle stopped scrolling on his phone entirely. The college student 2 rows back raised her recording camera a few inches higher, her thumb trembling slightly against the screen. Brenda noticed the phone and her smile disappeared entirely. Sir, I need you to keep your tone respectful. My tone hasn't changed, Marcus said. That was true, and it made her accusation feel even uglier hanging there in the recycled air. Gerald leaned in closer, crowding the narrow aisle, his voice dropping into something low and rough. Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of point you're trying to make, but we have been loyal to Continental Crest for over a decade. Marcus met his eyes without blinking, and I have been an American citizen for 46 years. The sentence landed harder than any shout could have. Diane sucked in a breath. Brenda's face hardened into something brittle. Gerald blinked, thrown off balance for half a second by the sheer size of what had just been named out loud in front of 40 strangers. This was never about a window seat. It never had been. It was about who gets believed first, who gets protected first, who has to prove over and over, in departure lounges and hotel lobbies and first-class cabins, that they are allowed to simply exist in the space they already paid for. Brenda straightened her spine. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to cooperate. I am cooperating with the terms of my ticket, Marcus said. I am seated in 2A. And if crew determines a seating change is necessary, I'll need that documented in writing. Your name, your employee number, the specific reason for the move, and confirmation that the reason is another passenger's personal preference. Brenda froze. For the first time since she'd stepped into that aisle, she looked past his face and actually saw something. Not fear, documentation. Most passengers folded the moment a uniform stood over them. Most people didn't want the scene, didn't want strangers staring, didn't want their dignity dragged out into a public aisle before takeoff. Marcus Whitfield had spent his entire adult life learning the difference between peace and surrender, and he had stopped confusing the two a long time ago. "There's no need to escalate this," Brenda said. "I'm asking you to document your own request," Marcus said. "That isn't escalation. That's accountability." The word landed on her like a spotlight switched on in a dark room. "Ridiculous," Gerald muttered. "Nobody's discriminating against anybody. We just want our usual seat." Marcus looked at him slowly. "Then why did your usual seat suddenly become my problem?" Gerald opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The question was too simple, and simple questions are dangerous precisely because the honest answer is ugly. "You're making everyone uncomfortable," Diane said softly, sharply. In that particular tone, certain women use like a scalpel. A man 2 rows up looked down at his hands. Nobody wanted to admit that Diane was, in the worst possible way, correct. Everyone in that cabin was uncomfortable. Not because Marcus was loud, he wasn't. Not because he seemed threatening, he didn't. They were uncomfortable because he had refused, quietly and completely, to disappear. "I'm going to get the cabin supervisor," Brenda said, turning on her heel, her low pumps striking the carpet in tight, furious little steps. "Please do," Marcus said. Diane set her handbag down on seat 2B, like a flag planted on foreign soil. Marcus glanced at it. So did the college student, still recording from 2 rows back. "That seat isn't yours either," Marcus said. "It's just a bag. Then move it." The words were quiet, clean, and final. Diane stared at him, genuinely stunned that he had spoken to her without a trace of apology in his voice. Gerald snatched the bag away himself, with a hard, jerking motion. "Happy now?" "No," Marcus said. "But accurate." Warren Doyle arrived from the forward cabin with the stiff, upright posture of a man who had spent 20 years in the Air National Guard and had never fully left it behind. He was 52, silver at the temples, and he listened to Brenda's version of events with his arms crossed and his jaw set before he had heard a single word from Marcus directly. Passenger refusing to cooperate. Legacy members displaced. Possible disruption to departure. Warren didn't ask why the boarding pass showed 2A. He didn't ask whether Gerald and Diane actually held assigned seats of their own. He heard the words that made his job simplest: refusing, disruption, legacy, and he walked down that aisle like he was already delivering a verdict. "Mr. Whitfield," Warren said, stopping beside Brenda. "I understand we're having an issue." "There's no issue with my ticket," Marcus said. "That's not what I asked," Warren said, and the temperature of the whole conversation dropped 10 degrees. This was no longer customer service. This was command, and command wanted obedience, not conversation. "My crew has asked for your cooperation so we can get this flight moving," Warren said. Gerald nodded behind him, emboldened. Diane crossed her arms again, watching Marcus the way a spectator watches a boxer she's certain is about to go down. Marcus felt every phone angled toward him now. He felt the old, familiar trap tightening around his own body from the inside out. If he raised his voice, they would call him aggressive. If he stayed silent, they would write his silence off as guilt. If he stood, they would call it threatening. If he stayed seated, they would call it non-compliance. So he chose the one weapon they hated most of all: precision. "Your crew is asking me to surrender a confirmed first-class seat," Marcus said. "Not for safety, not for a mechanical issue, not for a medical emergency, for another passenger's personal preference. Is that a correct summary?" Warren blinked. Brenda's face went tight. Gerald looked away. Marcus reached into his coat and drew out a slim black card case laying it flat on the armrest without opening it. "Before you answer that question," he said, "choose your next words very carefully." Warren stared at the case as though it might detonate. For the first time, some small, unwelcome part of him wondered whether the man in seat 2A was not, in fact, the problem, and whether he might instead be the consequence. He didn't like that feeling one bit. "Nobody here is questioning your right to fly," Warren said finally. "You're questioning my right to sit," Marcus answered. A hush rolled backward through the cabin, like a wave losing its energy against a seawall. The college student kept recording, her thumb trembling harder now. 2 rows up, a woman in her 70s lowered her reading glasses, her mouth pressed thin, with something that looked almost like shame. The particular shame of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize when politeness was being used as a weapon. "For God's sake," Gerald snapped, "just move the man. I have a connection in Seattle, and I am not missing it because somebody wants to make a point." Marcus turned toward him. "I am not making a point. I am refusing to be erased." The words didn't rise. They deepened. "To you it's just a seat," he continued, looking at Diane now. "To him it's routine. To her, a nod at Brenda, it's a service problem to be smoothed over. To you, Warren, it's a delay on a schedule. To me, it's memory. A younger version of himself flashed behind his eyes without warning. 24 years old. 1 cheap gray suit bought on layaway. 1 plane ticket he'd saved for 6 weeks to afford, flying to an interview in Chicago that could have changed the entire trajectory of his life. A flight attendant back then had told him there'd been a mix-up, that a white businessman needed his window seat, and Marcus, young, terrified, and desperate for that interview, had moved without a single word of protest. He had promised himself that night, silently, in a middle seat somewhere over Nebraska, that it would never happen to him again. Not loudly, not dramatically, in silence. The strongest promises a person ever makes are usually made when nobody else is watching. "I'm going to be very clear," Warren said, leaning in another inch. "If you refuse a crew member's instruction, this can become a security matter." Brenda's shoulders relaxed at the word security, the oldest shortcut in the book, the fastest way to turn simple discomfort into apparent authority. "So a confirmed seat becomes a security threat now," Marcus said. "Your behavior determines that," Warren said. "My behavior," Marcus repeated. His hands never left the armrests. His voice never climbed above conversational. His body never left that seat, still contained, still painfully controlled. "He hasn't done anything," the elderly woman 2 rows up said quietly. It came out soft, but it cracked something open in the cabin's silence. "Ma'am, please let us handle this," Brenda said. "I am watching you handle it," the woman answered, and did not look away. Up front, the gate agent, Yvonne Marsh, appeared in the aircraft doorway, her headset crooked, her face tight. "Warren, we are running out of departure window." "Perfect," Gerald muttered. "Wonderful, exactly what I was hoping to avoid." Marcus looked past Warren. "To Yvonne, please note in your log that this delay began the moment your crew attempted to remove a paying passenger from his assigned seat to accommodate another passenger's personal preference." Yvonne's eyes flicked toward the recording phone. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. "Mr. Whitfield has been uncooperative," Brenda said quickly, too quickly. Marcus opened the black card case, slowly, deliberately. The small motion pulled every eye in first class toward his hand. Leather folded back. A matte black card caught the overhead light. Marcus Whitfield, founder and chief executive officer, Meridian Trust Systems. Below his name sat a private line and an embossed company seal. Warren stared. Brenda stopped breathing for a full second. Yvonne's mouth parted slightly. Continental Crest had been courting Meridian for 8 months. Their customer service systems were outdated and had failed 3 federal audits in a row. Their algorithmic bias detection was practically non-existent. Tomorrow, the airline's own executive committee was scheduled to hear whether Marcus's board would approve the partnership that could finally air Bear's battered public image. After 3 consecutive years of viral videos and 1 blistering congressional hearing that had nearly ended the CEO's career, and its founder was sitting in seat 2A, not standing behind a podium, not shaking hands in a glass conference room, sitting under cold cabin lighting, while Brenda Sutcliffe tried to move him out of consideration for Gerald Ashworth's comfort. "Now," Marcus said, setting the card on the tray table, "would you still like to call this a security matter?" Warren's throat worked before any sound came out. He had seen that logo before, in internal briefing decks in one confidential email thread, marked urgent by the chief operating officer in a memo circulated to every senior manager 3 weeks earlier, titled Meridian Partnership. Final review. This was not a vendor. This was the company Continental Crest needed most, and its CEO had just spent 9 minutes being told he didn't belong in the seat he had already paid for. "What is that supposed to prove?" Gerald demanded. "It proves nothing," Marcus said. "My boarding pass already proved that. The card only proves how badly you judged the man holding it." "Mr. Whitfield," Warren said, his voice suddenly, desperately softer, "I believe there may have been a misunderstanding." "No," Marcus said. "There was a decision." "A misunderstanding is fog," he continued. "A decision has fingerprints." Brenda stepped forward, visibly scrambling to recover. "Sir, if I made you feel uncomfortable, that was never my intention." "You didn't make me feel uncomfortable," Marcus said, his eyes lifting to hers. "You tried to make me feel removable." The college student whispered "wow" under her breath, forgetting for a moment that her phone was still recording every word of it. Diane's confidence began visibly leaking out of her posture. She glanced around the cabin and noticed, for the first time, how many faces had changed. The passengers weren't just watching Marcus anymore. They were watching her, watching Gerald, watching Brenda, watching the small, ordinary machinery of privilege grinding and sparking in broad daylight. "I don't care who he is," Gerald said, refusing to bend. "This airline has always taken care of us, always." "That may be exactly the problem," Marcus said. At the aircraft door, Yvonne pressed 2 fingers to her headset. Her voice dropped low, but Marcus caught enough of it. "Yes, confirming now, the passenger is Marcus Whitfield. Meridian Trust Systems." The color drained visibly from Warren's face. Brenda heard it too. The story was no longer contained inside that aircraft. It had already left through a headset, moving across radios and phones and offices, where people with titles were about to start asking one very uncomfortable question. What did our own crew just do? Marcus picked up his phone and called Priya Anand. She answered on the first ring. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but with a familiar edge of tension underneath it. She knew him well enough to know he didn't call before takeoff, unless something had already gone wrong. "Notify the board chair," Marcus said. "Continental Crest has created an incident on Flight 942, first class, seat 2A. Multiple passengers recording." "What category?" Priya asked, without a second's hesitation. Marcus looked at Brenda, at Warren and Diane, sitting stiff and furious in 2C and 2D. "Discriminatory service escalation," he said. "Potential contract termination." 4 words. Clean. Corporate. Devastating. Brenda's breath went shallow. She understood enough about airline finances to know exactly what a failed partnership could cost. Executives their bonuses, departments their budgets, and frontline staff like herself their entire careers. "Do you want legal looped in?" Priya asked. "Yes," Marcus said, "but no public statement yet. I want facts first." That sentence changed the cabin more than any threat could have. He wasn't reaching for revenge. He was reaching for evidence. Captain Renata Voss stepped out of the cockpit at that exact moment. 54 years old, silver-streaked hair cropped close. 26 years of commercial flying behind eyes that missed nothing. She took in the scene in one sweep. Warren's frozen posture, Brenda near the galley wall, Gerald in the aisle, Diane clutching her handbag, Marcus seated with a business card visible and 3 phones recording him from different angles. She knew immediately this was not a routine seating dispute. "Mr. Doyle," she said, her voice low. "A word." Warren stepped toward her, the way a schoolboy steps toward a principal's office. Brenda tried to follow. Captain Voss lifted one hand without even looking at her. Not yet. That small command cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Warren leaned close and murmured the situation into her ear, gesturing once toward Marcus, once toward Gerald, once toward the seat itself. Captain Voss listened without blinking. Then Yvonne added something through the headset from the doorway. "Operations confirms it. He's the CEO of Meridian Trust Systems." Captain Voss's jaw tightened. She looked toward Marcus, and something like genuine regret crossed her face. Not enough to undo what had already happened, but enough to show she understood the scale of the failure unfolding on her aircraft. She walked to row 2. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I'm Captain Voss. I want to personally review everything that happened here." "I've been asking for that since the beginning," Marcus said. "Yes," she said, "I understand that now." She turned to Gerald and Diane. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, please take your assigned seats." Gerald stiffened. "Captain, with respect, we have flown this airline for 11 years. And today," Captain Voss said, her voice cold enough to frost glass, "your assigned seats are 2C and 2D. Diane looked genuinely offended. "You cannot be serious." "I am," Captain Voss said. 2 words, no room left inside them for negotiation. Gerald stared at her, waiting, out of pure habit, for the world to bend around him the way it always had. It did not. Slowly, bitterly, he stepped aside. Diane followed, her heels striking the carpet harder than necessary, both of them stiff and theatrical with the rare, unfamiliar humiliation of being told no in public. The aisle finally opened. For the first time since boarding, Marcus had room to simply breathe. But the damage was already done, and everyone in that cabin knew it. Captain Voss turned to Brenda, Miss Sutcliffe. "Forward galley, now." "Captain, I was only trying to accommodate our legacy passengers," Brenda said. "No," Captain Voss said. "You tried to remove a confirmed passenger without cause, and you did it because of what he looked like sitting in that seat. Don't insult either of us by pretending otherwise." Brenda's lips trembled. Respectfully, he was refusing to cooperate. Marcus spoke before the captain could answer. "I refuse to be moved for prejudice wearing the mask of procedure." The sentence struck the cabin like a closing argument in a courtroom. Nobody spoke. Not Gerald, not Diane, not Brenda, not Warren. Captain Voss ordered the forward cabin door kept open, and that single decision changed the sound of everything. The aircraft no longer felt like a sealed world where crew authority could quietly swallow the truth. Terminal noise drifted in from the jet bridge. A radio crackled somewhere outside. Continental Crest Operations was now listening, watching, waiting, and the walls, suddenly, had ears. Brenda stood in the forward galley, with her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform, trying to hold her face neutral. Her breathing gave her away, short, uneven, shallow. Warren stood beside her, tablet lowered, no longer any kind of shield. Gerald and Diane sat rigid in 2C and 2D, furious in the particular way. Only deeply embarrassed people can be furious. Marcus remained in 2A. The seat itself had never looked more ordinary. Leather, window, armrest, tray table. Nothing sacred about it at all, and nothing worth stripping a man of his dignity over. And yet here they all were. Yvonne stood near the aircraft door, headset pressed close. And she was smarter than most people gave her credit for. She had watched Brenda barely glance at that boarding pass. She had watched Gerald treat ownership like something inherited through habit alone. Now she watched the airline itself begin quietly to panic. "Operations wants written statements from everyone involved," Yvonne said. Brenda's head snapped up. "Everyone?" "Yes," Yvonne said. Can we at least finish boarding first? Warren asked. No, Captain Voss said from the galley doorway. We are not pushing back from this gate until it is documented. Gerald cursed under his breath. Diane whispered, "This is humiliating," mostly to herself. The elderly woman 2 rows up turned around in her seat. "So, was what you did to him," she said. Diane froze. The cabin shifted again, and that one quiet sentence seemed to give permission to every conscience in the room. Passengers who had watched in silence started sitting up straighter. Phones stayed raised. A man in row 5 said quietly, "I saw the whole thing." A woman near a window added, "He showed his ticket twice. They still tried to move him." Brenda heard every word like glass breaking behind her back. Marcus did not turn around to look at any of them. He didn't need the witnesses' approval. He knew witnesses often arrived late to these moments. But late truth still mattered, and it was still on its way. Yvonne stepped closer to him. "Mr. Whitfield, operations is requesting your full account." "I'll provide it," Marcus said. He opened the notes app on his phone and began speaking aloud with the calm precision of a man giving sworn testimony. "Continental Crest Flight 942, Denver to Seattle, Seat 2A. I boarded with a valid first-class ticket." Gerald and Diane Ashworth approached and claimed the row belonged to them based on habit. "Brenda Sutcliffe asked me to move despite confirming my seat assignment was valid." Warren Doyle escalated the matter and suggested my refusal could become a security issue. Each sentence landed clean and flat. Brenda stared at the floor. Warren closed his eyes. Gerald leaned forward. "You're leaving out the part where you were difficult," Gerald said. Marcus finally turned toward him. "What exactly did I do that was difficult?" Gerald opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence answered for him. Captain Voss stepped into the aisle. "Mr. Ashworth, you will not interrupt again." Gerald blinked, genuinely stunned by the flatness of her tone. "I am a Platinum Legacy member." "I am aware," she said, "and right now that does not help you." A murmur moved through the cabin, not loud, but enough. Yvonne looked down to hide a small flash of satisfaction. Then her headset crackled sharply enough that everyone near the front could hear it. Continental Crest Executive Response Team joining the line. Corporate Legal requesting confirmation that Mr. Whitfield remains on board and has not been removed. Yvonne answered clearly, confirmed. Mr. Whitfield remains in seat 2A. A pause. Then another voice, older, male-controlled, but visibly strained. "This is Preston Wallace, Senior Vice President of Customer Operations. Put me on speaker." Captain Voss nodded once. Yvonne tapped her headset and routed the call through the galley speaker. "Mr. Whitfield," Preston's voice filled the cabin. "On behalf of Continental Crest Airlines, I want to apologize for what has occurred." Marcus looked toward the speaker. The entire cabin waited for him to accept it graciously, the way everyone always expected him to, so that the discomfort could finally end. He didn't. "Mr. Wallace," Marcus said, "what exactly are you apologizing for?" The question froze the cabin colder than the silence before it. On the other end of the line, Preston Wallace visibly breathed in, and everyone heard it. "We apologize for the confusion around your seating assignment," Preston tried. "There was no confusion," Marcus said. "We apologize for how the situation was handled." "Handled by whom?" Marcus asked. Nobody breathed. Preston understood finally that this was not a man who could be soothed with a voucher or a stack of frequent flyer miles. Marcus Whitfield had built an entire company tracing the exact shape of bias, hiding behind neutral corporate language. He knew precisely how institutions apologized without ever admitting what they had actually done. "We apologize," Preston said, his voice lower now, "that Continental Crest personnel attempted to remove you from your confirmed first-class seat to accommodate another passenger's personal preference." Marcus waited. "And we apologize that this escalated after your documentation had already confirmed your right to remain in seat 2A. A murmur moved through the cabin, quiet, stunned, almost reverent. Brenda's eyes filled. But Marcus did not look away from the speaker. "And why did that happen?" he asked. "That was the blade." "Not what? Why?" Preston Wallace went silent. Captain Voss watched Marcus with something close to hard respect now. She had flown through wind shear over the Rockies and an engine warning light over the Pacific. But this was a different kind of pressure entirely. No alarms, no smoke, just one man forcing a corporation to name its own moral failure out loud in front of 40 witnesses and 3 cameras. "That is what our investigation will determine," Preston said finally. "No," Marcus said. "Your investigation will determine who participated. The why is already visible to everyone in this cabin." Diane made a small, offended sound. Marcus turned toward her. "You believed Mr. Ashworth deserved my seat because he expected it," Marcus said. "Miss Sutcliffe acted on that belief. Mr. Doyle escalated my refusal into a possible security threat. At every single step, my paid ticket mattered less than your comfort with my presence in that row." "That's not fair," Gerald snapped. "Fair," Marcus said, turning to him, "would have been sitting in 2C from the start." "Sterling Airways will launch an immediate internal review," Preston said. "Weaker now." "That is not enough," Marcus said. Brenda looked up sharply. Warren's shoulders dropped further. Preston did not interrupt. "I want the passenger service logs preserved," Marcus continued. "I want the tablet data preserved. I want every crew communication timestamp preserved. I want written statements from every employee involved. I want confirmation, in writing, that no passenger who recorded or spoke up today faces any retaliation whatsoever. And I want this incident reviewed by someone entirely outside your customer operations chain." Yvonne gave the smallest, almost invisible nod. She recognized exactly how precise those requests were. Too precise to be quietly buried. Each one closing a door where stories like this one usually vanished without a trace. "We can agree to preserve all records immediately," Preston said. "And the outside review," Marcus asked. A pause. "We would need to escalate that to the executive committee." "That sounds like a delay," Marcus said. "It is process," Preston said. "No," Marcus said. "Process is simply the word you use for delay when the people who were harmed are expected to wait quietly and be grateful for it." The sentence burned through the cabin. Even Gerald stopped moving. Marcus lifted his phone again, his thumb hovering over Priya's name. "Mr. Wallace," he said. "Meridian's board is scheduled to vote on your final partnership proposal tomorrow morning. Until an independent review is confirmed to me in writing, that vote is suspended indefinitely." Brenda closed her eyes. Warren looked at the floor. On the other end of the line, Preston Wallace inhaled sharply, as though struck. "Mr. Whitfield, that partnership carries enormous strategic importance for both our companies." Marcus looked out the small oval window at the flat-gray Denver sky. "No," he said softly, "integrity is strategically important. The partnership was only ever paperwork. There it was." The reveal had finally become a reckoning. Not loud, not theatrical, simply absolute. "Give me 5 minutes," Preston said. "You have 3, Marcus answered. Preston Wallace called back in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Nobody in first class spoke. While they waited, the air had gone thin and electric. Brenda stood motionless, pale under the cabin lighting. Warren kept his eyes fixed on the floor, replaying every assumption he had accepted without question, every shortcut that had led him to this exact moment. Gerald stared out toward the aisle with the stiff, cornered anger of a man discovering, for the first time in his adult life, that money had limits. Diane held her handbag in her lap like a shield that no longer worked. The speaker crackled. "Mr. Whitfield," Preston said, "the executive committee has agreed to an independent review. Written confirmation is being sent to your legal counsel immediately. All crew logs, tablet records, passenger service notes, and communications related to Flight 942 will be preserved without exception." Marcus glanced at his phone. A message from Priya had already appeared. Confirmation received. Board chair notified. Legal standing by. He set the phone face down. "Thank you," he said. The simple courtesy made Brenda lower her eyes even further. She had expected anger. Anger she could have explained away, labeled, folded into an incident report, and dismissed as a disruptive passenger. But Marcus's restraint had given her absolutely nowhere left to hide. His calm had become a mirror, and she did not like what it reflected back at her. Captain Voss stepped into the aisle. "Mr. Wallace, I am delaying departure further until replacement cabin leadership is assigned." Brenda's head lifted sharply. "Miss Sutcliffe, you are relieved from first-class service pending review," Captain Voss said, without looking at her. "I have served this airline for 19 years, Brenda whispered. "Then you knew better," Captain Voss said. The words landed with brutal quiet. Warren drew a slow breath. "And me? You will provide a full statement before this aircraft departs," Captain Voss said. "Operations will decide whether you remain on duty for the remainder of this trip." Warren nodded once, and something in him seemed to shrink. Not broken exactly, but finally thoroughly exposed. A replacement flight attendant walked in from the jet bridge, a woman in her 50s named Angela Reyes, calm and unhurried in a way that felt almost foreign after the last 20 minutes. She approached Marcus first. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "my name is Angela. I'll be taking care of this cabin for the rest of the flight. Can I bring you some water while we reset service?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Thank you. No suspicion, no extra scrutiny. No quiet performance of doubt behind her eyes. Just service. The ordinary, unremarkable thing that should have happened from the very beginning, before any of this had ever needed to happen at all." As Angela walked toward the galley, the elderly woman 2 rows up leaned across the aisle. "Mr. Whitfield," she said softly, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Marcus turned toward her. "You spoke when it mattered." "I should have spoken when it started," she said, her eyes filling. That truth hung in the cabin air far longer than any apology could have. Gerald shifted in his seat, uncomfortable in a way that no amount of money had ever been able to buy his way out of. Diane looked down at her folded hands. Neither of them said another word for the rest of the flight. 5 months later, Continental Crest Airlines announced, in a press release buried on page 4 of the business section, that its partnership talks with Meridian Trust Systems had officially collapsed. The internal review, the one Marcus had demanded in writing on the record, at 31,000 feet, had uncovered a pattern stretching back nearly 4 years. 17 prior complaints from Black and Latino passengers describing nearly identical treatment in first class, all of them quietly settled. All of them buried under non-disclosure agreements, none of them ever reaching the board. Preston Wallace resigned 11 weeks after the incident, under language his own communications team wrote as pursuing new opportunities. Warren Doyle was reassigned to ground operations at a regional hub in Omaha, a demotion dressed up as a lateral transfer. Brenda Sutcliffe was terminated after the review confirmed she had, in fact, downgraded 3 other passengers of color on that same route over the preceding 14 months, always for the exact same platinum legacy couple, Gerald and Diane Ashworth, who had never once been asked to move for anyone else in 11 years of flying that route. Continental Crest quietly revoked the Ashworths' platinum legacy status entirely, citing a pattern of conduct inconsistent with company values. Gerald wrote 3 separate letters to corporate demanding it be restored. All 3 went unanswered. He told friends at his country club, more than once, that he had been made an example of. He never once said the word sorry. Not to Marcus, not to Brenda, not to anyone. That refusal, more than any headline, was the thing that finally cost him his membership at that same club the following spring, after 2 other members quietly complained about sharing a dining room with him. Meridian Trust Systems, meanwhile, signed a far larger contract 8 months later with a competing airline that had reached out the week the story broke nationally, specifically because of how Marcus had handled it. Not with outrage, but with documentation, patience, and an absolute refusal to let the moment simply dissolve into an apology nobody meant. On a quiet Tuesday morning the following spring, Marcus Whitfield sat in C2A on a different airline entirely, flying home from a keynote in Austin. He wore the same charcoal coat, the same scuffed brown shoes, the same cracked leather watch on his left wrist, still ticking, still keeping time exactly the way his grandfather Otis had left it to him. A young flight attendant, maybe 24, glanced at his boarding pass, smiled and said, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Whitfield. Enjoy your flight." Nothing more, nothing less, exactly the way it should have been from the very beginning. Marcus looked out the window at the pale morning sky, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself simply sit there. Not braced, not waiting for the next shadow to fall across his row, just sitting in the seat he had already paid for, being exactly who he already was. If this story reminded you that dignity should never depend on how someone looks, what they're wearing, or someone else's comfort with their presence in the room, like this video so it can reach someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with anyone who's ever been asked to prove they belong somewhere they already paid to be. And tell me, in the comments, have you ever been in that cabin? On which side of it were you standing?